Welcome to the IRSV Annual Women in Industrial Relations event, for the first time being held in partnership with the Victorian Women Lawyers and the Law Institute of Victoria Workplace Relations Committee. I'm Virginia Wills, this year's Vice President of Flagship Functions and Events of the Industrial Relations Society Victoria. Now I'd like to acknowledge our event is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and Aboriginal elders or other communities who may be here today. Before we start, please let me say a few words about the Industrial Relations Society Victoria, or the IRSV, which is a society for anyone who has or would like to develop an interest in industrial relations. Its membership is from 5 main groups: trades unions, employers, government, academic institutions, and the legal profession. The benefits of IRSV membership include access to our Fair Work Commission advocacy course, free flagship annual events, and subscription to the Academic Journal of Industrial Relations. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining by checking out the Industrial Relations Society website. Also, a word about our 2 partners. The Law Institute of Victoria Workplace Relations Committee aims to represent the widest possible cross-section of legal practitioners in the area of workplace relations law. As well as providing information and resources to practitioners, it is involved in consultations on proposed law reform. The Law Institute of Victoria has allowed the IRSV to hire their venue at a reduced rate and helped coordinate tonight's event and catering, which we hope you are enjoying. The Victorian Women Lawyers is the peak representative body of women lawyers in Victoria. Among other things, they run the Warren Moot mentoring programs for students and professionals and publish an annual journal, Portia. We thank the VWL for engaging a videographer to make this talk accessible to those who couldn't join us in person tonight. So, this evening's topic is Women in Industrial Relations. I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker, Natalie. Natalie James has recently been appointed as the Secretary of the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. Ms. James has an extensive career in the public service and employment and workplace relations. From 2005 until 2010, she was Chief Counsel to the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations, becoming a State Manager of that department in 2010. In 2013, she was appointed the Fair Work Ombudsman for the Commonwealth. Recently, Ms. James has been a partner at Deloitte Australia, during which time she co-authored the report released only a couple of weeks ago entitled Rest, Restore and Reframe, Making Fair Work Flex Work, which is the specific topic of tonight's discussion. What we're going to have tonight is approximately a 10-minute address from Natalie. Then she'll answer a series of questions put by me, Virginia Wills from the Industrial Relations Society and union lawyer, as well as from the Victorian Women Lawyers, Sophie Lefebvre, a lawyer at the Victorian Government Solicitor's Office, and the Law Institute of Victoria Workplace Relations Committee, Alana Smith, a senior associate at Gilchrist O'Connell. And I've just realised we've got our tripartite industrial relations system well represented. Then we'll have time for a few questions from the floor. So we'll make sure to keep to time, which Sophie will help us with so that we can have those questions from you all. Here is Natalie James.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for that very kind introduction. You know, that's the first time I've heard someone say out loud Secretary for the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. And yeah, my head's still spinning. I do just want to mention that we also have skills, which is the thing I'm most excited about. But I'm not here today to talk about levers in the labour market, although maybe we can get to that a little bit later. But in the meantime, I'm just going to take you through some things that came out of a study that Deloitte did with Swinburne University that was focused on flex work, because there's some really interesting findings in it, quite unique findings, and there are a few gender perspectives in there as well. And of course, the way many of us work, well, in fact, all of us have been working, has changed dramatically over the last 2 years. There are things we didn't think possible that we're now doing, but things haven't changed in the same way for all cohorts, and that's part of what our report was about. So, just to give you an overview, we did a survey. So the report is based on a survey of 2,000 workers, and A journo asked me when we released it, so how did you, Natalie James at Deloitte, come to be doing this work? Aren't you off, she didn't put it in quite these terms, doing like investigating, helping employers deal with those underpayment issues and all that? And I'm like, yeah, but I guess that's kind of part of what makes the story interesting. One of the things about Deloitte is you can have a thought bubble, and if you can convince other people that it's a good thought bubble, they will invest in the thing. And the thing is that we, Deloitte, normally work for employers. I mean, we do work for employers. So it was a bit different that we were asking employees what they thought. But one of the things we sensed was that what people were doing and wanting from an employee perspective had changed dramatically. And if you're an employer, you need to know that. Because if you're an employer and you want talent in today's labour market, where we know the war for talent is real, then understanding where employees are at after a very difficult few years is really important. And so based on this survey, we framed questions around people's preferences about work, where they wanted to work, a big thing recently, because we've all been able to work in different locations from before. In fact, the default was working at home for those of us in Victoria for a really long time. But also, when are you working? What do you value about your work? But also the industrial relations lens. What instruments cover you? Are you working out of standard hours? What are you paid for these non-standard hours? And so kind of bringing together the flex work excitement alongside the IR system, which is very much bread and butter for the work we do at Deloitte. And one of the things that's really clear is the war for talent is real, and flexibility and wellbeing are sitting at the heart of it. Now, this probably won't surprise anyone, but when we get to the data around just how important wellbeing was, well, even I was surprised by that. The other key thing is there is this divide that has opened up between the people whose tool of the trade is the laptop, like me, who can work pretty much anywhere, and many of us are working from home still a lot of the time because that's what we choose. Between those people and the people who need to front up, the people who are stacking the supermarket shelves, who are servicing, who are working in those EDs that are so overwhelmed at the moment, who are fronting up to the classrooms, like my sister did all through COVID, to teach kids when they weren't locked down. She wasn't. She was in Queensland. Wasn't such an issue there. But nevertheless, what about them? People like me have got all this flexibility. I can work from home. I can turn up when I want. I can go for a run at 8 and have my breakfast at 9 and do my first meeting at 10, which is exactly what I did today. And I did work from, I just want to say, 7 till 8:30, 6:30. Anyway, and so I can do that. But the people that need to front up are still fronting up. And what does that mean in a labour market where we can't get enough people to serve beer and chips at the MCG? So key findings. Firstly, many people, so the survey was in the field in January this year. So lockdowns weren't in place, and vaccinations were well and truly up and running, although we did have Omicron running. But 1 in 3 workers said they were working more hours since the pandemic. So that's a significant cohort of people saying they're working more. More than half working outside of standard hours at least once a week. It's higher for flex workers. 41% of those who do are flex workers, and they were self-defined, right? So we basically said to people, can you work flexibly or do you have to be an on-site worker? Flex workers are much more likely to be determining their own patterns of work. Now, this is probably familiar to you. Many of you are among that cohort. 4 in 5 flex workers want to work hybrid or from home. So those of you in working for employers who want to order people back to the office, think about that. And while on-site workers currently can't work hybrid, 2 in 5 of them want to, which might explain some of those labour market shortages, right? Because if you've got the choice, if you can reskill or you already have the skills to do a job that you can do from your laptop, there's some appeal there, right? 93% of workers rated their well-being as important to them as pay. So that was we asked people a series of questions about here's a bunch of things you can pick from that are to do with your work. What's most important to you? 93% picked well-being. 2 in 3 workers were prepared to forego extra pay to retain their existing flexibility or for more. Now, my question would be, why can't we have both? And so there's a whole discussion to be had around productivity, flexibility, but you see there the value of it for people. So we weren't asking people to go backwards, but it blew my mind in a labour market like ours, where wages growth is at historic lows, that people were prepared to forego more money. Now, there were about 10% of people, 10% of flex workers who were prepared to forego between 11 and 20%. You might presume they're already pretty well paid, but that's pretty interesting, right? 10%, it's 1 in 10 flex workers, 11 to 20%. That kind of blew my mind as well. Now, here's an interesting one, compensation. I'm going to have to step out because I can't read. 28% of flex workers were not getting paid any sort of compensation for their non-standard hours. That doesn't include the salaried people, which is a whole other conversation, that they might think they're getting compensated, but whether they are or not is another question. But this was much higher than the on-site workers. So there's this piece here, I think, this divide between people who are expected to front up and are often rostered. And so that's a traditional employer is directing that cohort as to when and where they work, traditional employment model, versus people where there's maybe more work, but there's more flex about when and where they're doing it. So let's go to a few gender dimensions of this. And so one of the things that we found is, and this isn't surprising, women were much more likely to say that they wanted home as their primary place of work. And so what we start to see here is a theme around choices being made based on other roles outside work in all probability, right? So 40% of women said they would prefer home, and that's pretty striking. There was a pretty big difference there between the men and the women. When it came to the life benefits of flexible working, then there wasn't actually surprisingly a lot of difference between people who identified contributing to domestic duties as a benefit of, so in other words, I can get to those domestic duties because I'm working flexibly. It was actually pretty similar between men and women, which was interesting. But when it came to male on-site workers, they were much less likely to pick that. So that also kind of tells you something. There's something about when people are in the home that they see the opportunity to contribute more to the household side of things. But when they go off to work and then they come home, they don't want to bar. So, and that's a hypothesis. And so, again, I can't read my little notes. Men were more likely to work non-standard hours than women, and so again, that might be to do with that home load, right? And interestingly, back to that question of compensation, what people are being compensated for, men are more likely to be in the overtime stream than women, and women are more likely to be getting toil. And so that's kind of interesting. I can tell you from our compliance work that toil is a dog's breakfast. Every employer that we see in Deloitte toil is pretty common, right? But it is almost more common than not that there is no centralised tracking of toil. It's not at all clear that banking and paying out is happening. It's much more informal. Now, that doesn't mean it's not happening, but it does mean it's very difficult to demonstrate that it is, whereas overtime, that's in the hand, in the pay packet, proximate to when it happened. And it's probably linked into another piece of data that I'll take you to towards the end of this. So some of this data is not in the report. We pulled some extra data for this presentation because there were some interesting gender distinctions. Who decides your place of work? Men were much more likely to say that they were deciding where they worked than women. And so there was about a 10% difference there. On the other hand, men were also more likely to identify that the job was requiring them to be on site. But it's kind of interesting, that distinction. And I'm still not sure whether that's, that question of who decides where you work is not entirely objective, but it's interesting that it looks there like maybe men at least feel like they have more choice. I wanted to show you this graph. This is in the report because we asked people what are the life benefits of having increased flexibility with work. And you can see there that there are a number of things people could choose from. So they weren't limited. I think they could choose 5 or so here. So you can see that there are some similar, the breakdown there is between flex and on-site. That's not a gendered breakdown. But you can see there better work-life balance. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? Comes up really high there. And what it is that people value the most. And it's all about life. The well-being things have come through really strongly. So what we see here is that well-being is an enabler. Flexibility is an enabler of well-being, and well-being is highly valued. So here, a few of the gendered elements of the life benefits. What we saw were women really identifying more strongly than men life benefits that related to health, and so work-life balance, but also the physical and mental health came through very strongly as what women were seeing as things that flexibility helped them with. And so that was an interesting dimension. Now, there were some clear links, and there's more data we will over time pull from this report around links between what industrial instrument you're under and other things that flow from it. And so what we see here is that men are more likely to be under an EBA than women. And women are more likely to be award covered. And so lots of things flow from that, including in our report, in our survey, we found that if you are on an EBA, you are much more likely to have a work from home policy in place. And we know that EBAs, by and large, deliver better pay and a range of entitlements that are above minimum. And so here probably we're seeing a number of things, but mostly what we're seeing is the gendered nature of our workforce. So if you think of the award-reliant sectors, they also tend to be feminised, they also tend to be low paid. I won't promise to fix this in the next 3 years, but it's my number one priority. My number one priority, if you think about pay equity, the gendered nature of our workforce and participation in the labour market, I told you I'd get there. These are the things. And I'm going to give you one more data point. According to the Financial Women's Index, these people assemble data about gender across a number of data sources, and then they calculate how many years it will take for us to get to equity. They measure unpaid work based on HILDA data. Based on our current progress, in 58 years, we will reach equity when it comes to unpaid work. And if you want to know what's behind all of those responses in flexibility and the gendered elements, it's probably that. Women are carrying that load, and that hasn't budged. And we might think if we work, what's that got to do with employers? Heaps. Maybe we can talk more about that in the conversation. But policies around flexibility in the workplace, return to work from parental leave, and lots of other elements about flex policy are what enables all people to make a more equal contribution to the unpaid work that every household has, whether it's caring for children or other responsibilities. And 58 years is too long, is all I've got to say. Sorry, I've taken more time than I said I would. And I'll come and join you guys now, and we'll have some questions.
That was well worth the time. Speak on everyone's behalf there. So the first question, in the context of your career and leadership journey, in relation to tonight's topic, how have you observed work has changed over your career from your first job to the present?
So it's interesting reflecting on that scenario of the rostered worker versus I'll do my work around my day. My first job was at McDonald's. And I clocked in and clocked out on a piece of cardboard with grids on it, on a manual clocking on, clocking off machine. I was paid for every 7 minutes that I worked. I do remember a discussion once happening about whether Good Friday was a public holiday or a religious holiday, and therefore whether I got penalty rates. I didn't understand what they were. But, I think a lot of people started out that way, and a lot of people are still working in that very rostered environment. But now, once I got my degree and I went into the public service, that's where I've spent most of my career, still turning up to the office. But I remember an early adopter and an early adapter, a graduate who worked for me, Nathan. He was very talented and very enthusiastic, and he would say, can I just go work out of a cafe for a bit and do this reading? And I'm like, sure, Nathan. And I messaged Nathan the other day and said, and he did great work from the cafe. I said, you're ahead of your time, Nathan, because now we're all doing that. And so, I think that, but it wasn't the norm, right? And if you fast forward now to where we are now, I really do feel this flex divide is really something we need to get our heads around. How is it that we provide flexibility to everyone in our workforce and value everyone in our workforce? And the fact that you've got large cohorts of people that need to come into work every day and deal with all that's associated with that is, I think that's something they're now looking at the people who are working from their laptops thinking, well, maybe that's what I want. And so we need to be more creative about putting flexibility at the centre of how we frame the employee value proposition. And when I was working at McDonald's, it wasn't really, Dad would drop me off for my 3-hour shift stacking fries, and then he would pick me up at the end. And, there wasn't a lot of sort of choice or agency in that scenario. But I think we've seen lots and lots of other changes in work as well. But I think the fundamental shift that we see now is that people who are working, knowledge workers, if you like, they no longer feel they need to be at any particular location. And I think that's a huge shift that employers need to get their head around. Now, we haven't made hybrid work quite yet, but that's probably also on employers to think a bit more creatively about how to get that done.
Former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard recently said that we know domestic and caring labour are not equitably distributed. If nothing changes in 5 years' time, what we'll see is that women, particularly in the family formation stage, have chosen disproportionately to work at home, and men have been much more regular attenders at the office. And if nothing else changes, that will show in who is being considered for a promotion, who is being considered for sponsorship and mentorship, and who is being put on the best training opportunities. Natalie, are we seeing more women than men working from home to enable domestic and caring work? And do you think this will have the effect that Ms. Gillard fears? And finally, if so, what can and should be done about it?
So firstly, there's no doubt, based on all sorts of evidence, that women are carrying out more of that domestic load across the economy. Not in every relationship, but across the economy, that's what's happening. And so that was the case before the pandemic and before we started working hybrid. So let's just pause and consider how this plays out pre-COVID. So we still had women doing, and in fact, I should say, there was progress in the COVID years of men doing more unpaid work because they were at home. They were as annoyed as the dirty dishes as everyone else. I mean, that's all I can surmise. And they could, but more fairly, they could, right? They could and they want to. But if COVID had never happened, Lord, then we would still be seeing that problem, but it looks different. What it looks like is women are part-time more than men. Women are having to leave more often than men to pick up the kids. Women are more likely to access their personal leave when the kids are sick than men. So all of that that was already happening. So hybrid work is not the problem. The problem is the underlying structural gender norms that influence where people are in the labour market and who's carrying the domestic load. And so we got to tackle that irrespective. And hybrid work and work from home is another tool through which we can tackle that. But it does require employers to consider the inclusivity elements of hybrid work and to be very deliberate about ensuring that the policies are inclusive, that the opportunities are fair, and this idea of being seen to be in the workplace is not an unfair advantage for those who are choosing other than that. But, what I'd like to see is more men taking advantage of the opportunities so the load is shared more. And Deloitte has just on International Women's Day actually issued a new policy for return to work parents. There are a number of dimensions to it, but the one that's kind of most novel, I think, is we say that if you return to work 4 days, we'll pay you 5. If you return 3 days, we'll pay you 4. So sort of trying to neutralise that financial element. And there are other factors around, targets for return to work parents, and that is gender neutral, right? I think we have to think very deliberately about the inclusion elements, because we did see Deloitte did a global survey of women at work, and the latest Women at Work report, which had, I think, about 500 Australian women in it, did show an increase in microaggressive behaviours and bullying, and a sense, again, the burnout question of women reporting they felt burnt out, and well-being, they were working more hours and well-being had gone down. Now, our survey suggests that's the case for everybody, but there's no doubt in my mind there's a gendered element of this. So I think we have to be really deliberate about it, but we also need to what we need to remember, though, I think, is that we now have choices that we didn't have before. So how do we try and ensure those choices are able to exercise fairly and that they don't have implications for career as a result? And that takes some deliberate steps on the part of employers, and clear policies is really important too, I think.
So I want to move away from the caring responsibilities as a single woman, mother of cats. Aside from the women who do have caring responsibilities, for the people like me who are at home alone, how do you see flexible work as impacting them differently to men, both in terms of the positive impact and also has there been any negative impact of flexible work?
Look, I don't know that, I do think that the caring piece is probably the most significant structural piece. There's no doubt that men and women are or have been, that there are different behaviours we see in the workplace. And I think, for example, women are more likely, but it's certainly not unique to women, to experience imposter syndrome. And I remember a moment during the pandemic where this came up with myself and a friend of mine. So remember when we were allowed to go 10K, and when we were allowed to, so I also live by myself, and for me the flexibility is do some work early when my brain's working, go for a run at 8, and then do my first meeting at 10. But I remember this friend of mine, we met at the Tan, because that was I was allowed to see her and we could meet in the middle kind of thing.
Venn diagram.
Yeah, and language warning. And this was the second round of lockdowns, big lockdowns, right? This was last year. And so, the wear and tear of this, as we all recall, was pretty awful. And she said to me, "How are you?" And I went, "I'm pretty fucked, frankly. It's shit, right?" And she said, "Yeah, you pass through the niceties and you just go straight to, it's awful." And she was like, "Yeah," repeat all the bad words. And then she said, "And my imposter syndrome's got really out of control." And I went, oh. And then I went and Googled it, and imposter syndrome was a thing during lockdown. I hadn't appreciated this. Imposter syndrome gets worse with isolation, because a lot of the things that counter those feelings, if you've got self-doubt happening, I just did that meeting, was that all right? Or was I a complete idiot in it? A lot of the reassurance you get is informal, because in the normal world, you leave the meeting and you walk with people, and just say it's a client meeting, so the client goes away and you guys go, "Was that okay? Did that?" And you can do your high fives, or you can do that. "Well, that was a bit weird, but it was fine. We'll whatever." You get straight up kind of informal feedback. Whereas when you're working from home, everything has to be a goddamn meeting and everything has to be half an hour, and so it's a lot harder to simulate that spontaneity. And so I think there are a number of things that we're still working through, even in our heads, around, well, what does that mean? So for me, constant isolation was very bad. I had to do things to help me deal with that kind of dissonance of coming off back-to-back calls and then having this silence, and then going into the kitchen and thinking, "Who made this mess?" It's you're the only one who's been there. You made this mess. But it's kind of your brain is tricked into thinking you're somewhere else, right? And I do think there's quite a lot of wear and tear associated with that. And so I hadn't even thought that imposter syndrome was enhanced by lockdown, but it makes all the sense in the world. And if you Google it, if you hadn't thought about it, Google it. There's a heap of stuff there. So to me, the perfect balance is a bit at home when you're doing stuff that you do well on your own. Like for me, that's reading and thinking, and work reviewing. But when you actually want to collaborate and work with people, I want to be in front of a whiteboard. I'm sorry, I'm old school like that, and you cannot do it in the same way on a screen. You can Miro me to death, and I can't make those damn post-its work. So, as much as I've tried, so I think there are a number of other elements that just go to confidence and presence, and so I kind of think hybrid, if we can make it work, is a good optional round, because you're getting some of that face time and you're getting some of that informal stuff, and there is a lot that does sort of happen through informal connections. And I think 100%, like I would counsel people that working from home all the time is not necessarily going to be ideal for the team or them, but in the end I favour choice, and if you can make that work.
Nice segue to operating costs and flex work. So anecdotally, I've heard of employees having to obviously fit out their home office, pay for the heating in winter all day when they're at home, even having to upgrade the homes to fit a home office, or the more minor costs like toner and everything else. So while employers might be reducing the size of their city real estate, so one of the unresolved issues is when it is an expectation that employees will do at least some of their work from home if we get there, who should pay for the costs of running the home office? Yeah. And more broadly, if I could just do a double barrel, how do you think employees and employers should apply the Fair Work system to ensure workers' rights are protected to the same degree as they are for more traditional full-time permanent 9-to-5 on-site jobs, so that the flex work jobs are not in danger of being casualised, deregulated, and so that the hours of work in addition to standard hours are properly remunerated?
So on the first piece, sorry, tell me the first piece again.
Yeah, so operating costs.
Operating costs, right. Look, it depends, right? Like when we were all locked down, we didn't have a choice. And so it kind of depends on the posture of employers right now. So at Deloitte, people have 100% choice. Well, yes, no, they do. There was a period, maybe it is still the case, that let's put aside the vaccination policy. Put aside, everyone is vaccinated in my theoretical world right now. And so people have a choice. And so when it's your choice, I think it's different from when it is being thrust upon you. And I don't know that there are many employers out there ordering people to work from home, although I was aware of a government department a little while ago that implemented hot desking and actually did implement a 1 day at home policy. So it probably is happening. And so I think that's relevant to this question about who should pay. The number one priority in my view is to have clear policies about this. So have clear policies about where the costs should lie. And I think that it is very different when you're choosing it to suit you. And so, but I also think you need clear policies around work from home and hybrid work and how that's going to work and what is a genuine choice. And so, I think that these are new frontiers for us, but the old school principles still apply, which is consultation and clarity. And then, there's a separate discussion around the way this fits into discussions around productivity, because we are saving time with the commute, and there are other huge advantages. We see the employee engagement advantages of people being able to have this choice. And so that is a value to them, but it's a value to their employers as well, because they're happier, they're more engaged, they're more likely to stay. So I think that we've got this opportunity to kind of recalibrate how we think about productivity and the value of these things. And so, when we were locked down, I mean, it is, and it also depends on how often you're working from home. I spent a lot of the first lockdown working from my kitchen bench, and eventually I realised a friend insisted that it was bad for my head. I completely reconfigured my house to set up a front office, and that was more about my mental health than anything else. I could certainly keep working from the kitchen bench. There's nothing impractical about it, but there are elements of choice in this as well about how you want to be set up and where you choose to work. And so I think that it depends a lot on those elements, and it depends a lot on the employer's policy, but clarity around the policy is the most important thing. The second part of your question was kind of around the intersection between the Fair Work system and this new weird age of self-determined, it's not entirely self-determined work, but look, I don't look at it from the point of view of give them the same protections as the rostered workers, because I think there are choices being exercised here as well. I think that but one thing I will say is, again, we didn't need lockdowns and COVID to tell us that there are issues with hygiene when it comes to employee hours of work and record keeping, right? There are millions and millions of dollars of underpayments to workers that we've seen reported in Australia, a large proportion of which have arisen because people are not being paid for all of the hours they are worked. In fact, that's most of what's behind the underpayments, right? It's not that these big multi-million-dollar underpayments are not migrant workers being paid $7 an hour. That's still happening. But that's not what's behind these corporate underpayments. What's behind these corporate underpayments is people not being paid for all hours worked. And that is most commonly, that's going to happen with some rostered cohorts. So there are tricks of the trade. Guys, if you're rounding up and down, if people aren't recording time, if you're just paying rosters, like these are all signs that you've probably got some hidden underpayments there. But the biggie is salaried workers. The biggie is people who are paid an annual salary that is assumed to cover all their hours of work, and there is zero visibility of the actual hours of work. So there's just this assumption that you're paid above award and it's probably enough. That is what's behind a huge proportion of that multi-million-dollar underpayment. That's happening with rostered workers. That's happening with supermarket managers, right? I think that we need to really reflect on how it is that even before all this, the flex work bonanza, the chaos of, oh my God, starting work at 10, split shift. That's what I did this morning, my split shift, several split shifts actually. Do we count the hour I spent on the tram? Half on a meeting. Was I at work or commuting? I don't know. But all of that was happening well before the flex work side of things, right? And so now we've got another layer on top of this. And so we have an IR system that says, there's standard hours and you get paid more for out of standard hours. But the IR system also kind of assumes that the employer tells you when to work. And that's true for some people and not true for others. And so there's a lot of different things going on here for people. There's more hours being worked. Like our survey shows that some people are working more hours, but there's also more choice. And so, I think that firstly, I would say that employers need to have visibility of hours that people are working, whether or not they're coming into the office or not, because you're just as likely to get these. We have seen these issues arise with rostered staff, and so, or frontline staff, should I say. And so I think there's a key issue here about the hygiene around having visibility of hours worked. And there are health and wellbeing reasons that should be happening as well. And so, regardless of whether you agree with a lot of the fundamentals of our system and whether they are aligned with how many of us are working, they're the rules right now. And I think that's a key thing that's been going on in our system for a number of years now that a lot of people missed.
Thank you. I'm going to say that we'll switch to taking some questions from the floor. So I think we've got a few volunteers with some roving mics that might be able to go around if people want to put their hands up if they have a question for Natalie. Amanda up here. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the presentation, Natalie. That was incredibly interesting to hear about the research and the findings. I'm keen to ask you your thoughts on the 4-day week. We're seeing a lot of jurisdictions around the world at the moment implementing a 4-day week since the pandemic and also prior to the pandemic too. So, just curious to hear your thoughts on the 4-day week and how that fits in with flexible work.
At Deloitte, I kind of implemented my own 4-day week because we can kind of just do that. And my Deloitte crew know that Mondays are my yellow light day. I turn my Skype light to yellow and I put an out of office on. And I do some work sometimes, but sometimes I go to the pool and sometimes I go to the physio and sometimes I clear thousands of emails and often I do the reading, thinking stuff. But as far as they're concerned, I'm not there. So, but I'm not covered by an award. But firstly, I would highly recommend it. I would highly recommend it because when you work really intensively for 5 days a week, every week, I mean, I'm actually too old for it. Don't tell the minister. Well, actually, one of the first things I said to the minister was I was going to go 4 days a week. I live in Melbourne. Anyway, it's really kind of funny. I do still live in Melbourne, but I'm not going to be going 4 days a week. But here's the thing, right? I think it would be an awesome thing to trial. But how does that work with all of this stuff we've just been talking about, right? If you're doing your 4 day week by doing longer 4 days, for example, then if you're award covered, you're going to trip into this non-standard thing straight away. And technically the employer's got to pay you penalty rates or overtime or whatever. And so it depends how it's done. Like, I can't get my head around how a 4 day week, if it involves, and it's bound to involve some longer days, I think. I don't think we're going to be 20% less productive. Although there's probably a savings in the, I think the engagement and the motivation might lead to more productive work on those 4 days as well. You could have very focused workforce for 4 days. So I'd love to see us trial it here. And I think some companies are, but I can't get my head around how you'd do it if you've got award covered peeps. It could be really tricky there. But let me mention another example. I'm telling everyone I can about this. So 4 days a week would be awesome. But some industries are fighting for the 5 day week. And so in construction traditionally works a 6 day week. And I met the most amazing woman who is the CEO of a construction company. Her name is Alison Myrams. Look her up. CEO of Roberts Co., who has been trialling on New South Wales government building site 5 day weeks. 5 day weeks instead of 6 day weeks. They managed to convince the union that this could be done and delivered on time to budget 5 day weeks. So the mostly men who work for her company, although she's done pretty well lifting a number of women at her company, could have Saturdays with their family. And think about what that means. Not just for those men who haven't been able to do the school sport or haven't been able to just have a proper weekend break, but for their partners who are limited in their ability to participate in the labour market because they've got a partner who works 6 days a week. And so if you look this up, there's a wonderful video where the people involved in this pilot talk about what it meant to them and the change. And the New South Wales government is now building it into their procurement rules. So, there's a really nice and different discussion involving the construction industry and productivity that would be nice to have. And so on-site workers, right? What does flexibility mean and what does wellbeing mean? It's a good conversation. It's a different conversation to be having and to be remembering that in different sectors, they still don't have a 5 day week officially. So, yeah.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you so much for your presentation. And my question is around working from anywhere policies. So we've talked about working flexibly, working from home, but I think it was pretty much, I'm not sure about, the survey data, I was assuming it was from Australia. So Australia being a country with many migrants, some of them also recent migrants, and COVID having had an impact on people that haven't been able to go back as frequently as they used to yearly. We've seen, people potentially wanting to go back and having the possibility to work from whichever location, somewhere in a different jurisdiction. So have you seen in your work that you've done at Deloitte, organisations getting some sort of work from anywhere policy done well, or is it possible? Is it too challenging in terms of the occupational health and safety, I'm imagining, or tax issues?
I guess you're right. Mostly when we're talking about the flexibility, we're talking about people who are still located close to, in a city where there's an office, and they're probably coming in some of the time. The next level is the people who want to move interstate, and that can raise some other issues, because if you've got a scenario where you can never come into the office without getting on a plane, there are some different scenarios there. When you go to overseas, different scenarios again. I would distinguish between ongoing and permanent, I think that would be hard and short term. And the best example I can talk to is actually my own firm. So Deloitte very early on worked through all of this from all the implications and identified countries, and partly this is about tax, where people could do exactly what you've described. They could go and see their families again, and they could work for part of that period. And many, many people have done that. The biggest challenge is the time difference. And so for them, what that means is operating in 2 time zones, and that can be pretty difficult. But, you know, we've had people be able to go and be with family members who were literally on their deathbed, and be able to spend time with them and spend longer time, because, I mean, it's such a long way, Australia from most places. And so this ability to spend longer time and have more quality time. And so we've certainly made that work. And I've worked with one of the people who worked on the survey was in France for a decent chunk of the time towards the end. And I just had to keep being reminded of the actual hours, because at one point it was like, I could maybe do that meeting. And I'm like, what time would it be? 1 a.m. I said, no, you're not doing that meeting. Someone else can do that meeting, I think. But yeah, I think that's the only thing. You've got to be prepared to manage the time zone element. But we've certainly made it work really well.
I think we've got time for one more question.
What's your observations around people who work rostered hours but like from home? So have you had like a different kind of result with like the kind of outcomes, I guess, because it's a sort of different setting, like you're still doing the 9 to 5 hours, but you're possibly working in isolation?
Yeah, our survey we probably could drill down. We could probably do some data matching across different cohorts, but we asked a question, you know, who determines your hours of work, or how are your hours of work determined? And we kind of asked people if they were rostered or what have you. And if we paired that with can you work, does your job require you to be on site or not, you'd probably end up with, it might be a relatively small cohort. So we didn't focus in on them is the answer to the question, but you could. I'm imagining the kind of person who might be in that category is call centre workers, and they may be rostered, it might not even be 9 to 5, they could be rostered all sorts of hours. And I think that, I mean, it's interesting, like call centres are known for not being awesome environments, right? Like they kind of hit a number of triggers around low agency and low wellbeing. I should say, as an aside, when I was at Fair Work Ombudsman, our Fair Work info line was a revolution when they moved to scheduling their own breaks. And guess what? The phones always still got answered. It was, yeah. If you're, I don't know, is a call centre worse when you're at home or in the set? Like, I think it might depend on the type of person you are, but it would be very isolating. And then you've kind of got the advantage of being able to do it from home, but you've lost any agency around time worked. And I think that's worth a lot for people. But perhaps in some of those environments, you might have some choice around rosters and roster times. And when we think about how can we give on-site workers more flex, if you could, I mean, and there's excellent rostering systems around these days. If you could work out a way of enabling or feeding in more worker choice into times of work, then that would be one way of helping those on-site workers have some sort of choice and agency about at least when they work. Even though they're still rostered. There might still be ways of injecting choice into that. So, yeah. But I think they would be a minority cohort. That group.
It's interesting though, because I think you've got 3 cohorts as opposed to just 2.
Yeah. Yeah. It would be interesting to, like, call centre workers is the primary one that comes to my mind. What other types of workers might be heavily rostered? But
Anyone who has to take the phone
yeah.
from home.
Yeah.
Which is not just also.
Yeah. So it's that kind of customer service coverage. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah, future research
I'm
topic.
just on the beach.
Well, thank you, Natalie. That was a fabulous presentation. We have a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
Like everyone to join me to thank Natalie. Please please look out for the next Industrial Relations Society Victoria event, which is Meet the Commission, which is an event held at the Fair Work Commission and an opportunity for members of the profession to meet sitting members of the Fair Work Commission, which will be held in a couple months' time. Thank you and good night.